Good evening, those of you online and here with us today in The Hague. My name is Dan Galpern. I'm the longtime legal and policy advisor to the climate scientist James Hansen, and I'm also the general counsel of Climate Protection and Restoration Initiative. We're here to discuss the significance of the current proceedings before the World Court, the International Court of Justice, on the legal obligations of states in respect of climate change. And what I've done, put on the screen, are the two central questions before the court that we will be speaking to and about today. So as not to make this a vision test, I'll read the two central pieces of it. These are the questions that were referred to the World Court by the United Nations General Assembly last year at the behest of the Republic of Vanuatu and unanimously agreed to by the Assembly. What are the obligations of states under international law to ensure the protection of the climate system and other parts of the environment from anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases for states and for present and future generations? And secondly, what are the legal consequences under these obligations for states where they, by their acts and omissions, have caused significant harm to the climate system and other parts of the environment? With respect to states, including in particular small island developing states, which due to their geographical circumstances and level of development are injured or especially affected by or are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change, and also with respect to peoples and individuals of the present and future generations affected by the adverse effects of climate change. With us today are, of course, Dr. James Hansen. I'm going to introduce everyone at first, the whole panel. Dr. Hansen is the former director of the NASA Goddard Institute of Space Studies and current director of Climate Science Awareness and Solutions, which is a program of the Earth Institute at Columbia University in New York City. Dr. Hansen is the author of the books Storms of My Grandchildren and the forthcoming Sophie's Planet, and he's the principal author or co-author of numerous papers on the subject of climate change, Earth's energy imbalance, and solutions to these problems. And he is in the middle of us. To Dr. Hansen's immediate right is Ilko Rolling, professor of ocean and climate change at the Earth Sciences Department at Utrecht University, and he is an expert on sea level change and climate sensitivity in the geological past and future. Ilko is also editor-in-chief at Oxford Open Climate Change. To Ilko's immediate right is Appy Slugis. Did I pronounce your last name correctly? Can you say it again?
It's Appy Slice.
Appy Slice. Very good. That was easier. And he is the professor of paleoceanography at the Earth Sciences Department at Utrecht University. Appy is an expert on climate change in the geological past. He works on the causes and effects of CO2 concentration variability on temperature, rainfall patterns, and sea level. And then to my right is Ingrid, you better pronounce your last name. Ingrid Robains, who is the professor of ethics of institutions at the Ethics Institute at Utrecht University. She is an expert on economic, social, and climate justice, and in particular their intersection. And I already introduced myself. So, Jim, I'm going to turn it over to you. Let me advance the slide. Okay, Dr. Hansen.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dan, and thanks for arranging this, and thanks to my Dutch colleagues who agreed at the last moment to to join this panel. Human-caused climate change is poised to be the greatest injustice in history. The reach of climate change is global. The scope of climate change within the lifetime of a young person today will be monumental and tragic if governments are allowed to persist on a path of pretense and denial. Climate change is intergenerational injustice, as innocent young people and their children will suffer the most severe consequences. Equally, it is international injustice, as nations that have done the least to cause climate change stand directly in the path of the gathering climate storm. Climate change must be brought to the International Court of Justice because young people, developing nations, and indigenous people have nowhere else to turn. The nation states have failed the most vulnerable people, leaving them at the mercy of the most powerful members of the global community, who turn deaf ears and blind eyes to the well-being of the public. Nations of the world meet at annual COP meetings, conferences of the parties, where they promise to reduce emissions to net zero at some distant date. It's almost a meaningless pledge. There is no plan to actually stabilize climate. Instead, there is dickering over potential payments to the most affected nations. Such illusory payments seem more immediate than long-term climate change. So they are dangled out front like a carrot as a bribe to continue business as usual. Meanwhile, real-world emissions remain at a level driving climate inexorably toward conditions out of humanity's control, leaving a global community increasingly unjust and ungovernable. Young people recognize the fecklessness of the current business as usual treadmill, and they have faith in science, and they want to work toward a bright future, but they need help. A clear opinion of the court just might provide a jolt to the consciousness and the conscience of global leaders. But where is scientific advice? The United Nations is served by a huge scientific apparatus, but we hear little scientific objection to the farcical climate strategy at COP meetings. Voluminous IPCC reports contain good data, but what good are data alone? Scientists are the physicians of the planet. We have a moral obligation for diagnosis and advice, in my opinion. My comments here are based on a paper published a year ago in Oxford Open Climate Change and a paper accepted for publication in Environment, which my co-authors and I expect to appear in the January issue. Global temperature, if I move my charts, there it is.
Mouse, you need that one.
Oh, wrong mouse. Global temperature took an unprecedented leap of 0.5 degrees Celsius in the past 2 years, which confounded the climate research community. The warming coincided with an El Nino, but the El Nino was weak and could cause warming of only 1/4 degree, half of the observed warming. Another big factor had to be involved, which we suggested in the Oxford Open paper, was the Great Inadvertent Aerosol Experiment, which is caused by restrictions on the sulfur content of ship fuels. as shown in my next figure, uh, which was imposed in coastal regions in 2015 and then on the global ocean in 2020. Emissions from ships include aerosols that produce a negative forcing, a cooling, by reflecting sunlight, mainly via increased cloud cover, as aerosols serve as condensation nuclei for clouds. Thus, conventional pollution control results in fewer aerosols, which causes a positive forcing, a warming, by reducing cloud cover and enabling more solar radiation to reach Earth's surface. We evaluated the forcing stemming from controls on the maritime emissions as half a watt, 0.5 watts per meter squared, based on satellite observations of increased absorbed sunlight in the North Pacific and North Atlantic. That forcing of half a watt is just what is needed to explain the anomalous warming, as shown in the next chart. After the El Nino contribution to global warming is removed, there's still anomalous warming of 0.3 of a degree Celsius in 2023 and 2024, the green curve in the bottom figure. The ongoing solar maximum contributes 0.1 of a degree Celsius warming, and decreased aerosols contribute 0.2 of a degree. Both as follows from a simple forcing response calculation. So the entire warming is accounted for. Confirmation is provided by the geographical distribution of the warming. The warming occurs it begins in 2020 at the latitudes in the northern hemisphere where the aerosol forcing occurs. The temperature increase in the North Pacific and North Atlantic already contributes as much to global warming as does the El Nino in the tropics, and the response to aerosol forcing is still growing. Implications of the aerosol effect are staggering. Warming of the ocean surface will not go away. We are now living with an ocean that provides increased drive for strong storms and extreme flooding. Global temperature will decline a bit as the tropics goes into its La Nina phase, but we are now living in the plus 1.5 degrees Celsius world, averaged over the Nino cycle, and we are headed higher. An even more important implication is that climate sensitivity is not 3 degrees Celsius for doubled CO2, which has been IPCC's best estimate. When aerosol effects are accounted for, observed global warming implies a climate sensitivity of 4 to 5 degrees for doubled CO2. Now I need this mouse. The climate sensitivity the high climate sensitivity combined with steady or declining aerosol cooling implies that global warming will accelerate more unless the growth of greenhouse gas forcing declines rapidly. Thus, an honest assessment of the growth of greenhouse gas forcing is in order. Is the world making progress toward stabilizing climate? The next slide shows the annual growth of greenhouse gas climate forcing. It's enormous, almost half a watt per decade. A decade ago, IPCC concluded that we needed to follow a path close to RCP 2.6 if we wanted to keep global warming under 2 degrees Celsius. But we have not reduced emissions growth at all. It's still almost half a watt per decade. This huge gap between reality and the 2 degrees Celsius scenario could be closed by drawing down CO2 out of the air and sequestering it. But the annual cost of that has now reached $3.5 to $7 trillion. So it will not happen. We are headed to global warming greater than 2 degrees Celsius. We are not focusing on this situation at the COP meetings. Why are we not focusing on that? Why do we pretend that we're still on a path that will keep global warming under 2 degrees Celsius? And why do we not have realistic analysis of this situation? The reason greenhouse gas forcing continues to increase is that fossil fuels provide most of the energy. Provide most of the world's energy, as shown in this figure. Fossil fuels are an amazing condensed form of energy that has raised living standards in much of the world. There's little merit in painting the fossil fuel industry and nations that contain abundant fossil fuels as being evil. Whether they are liable is a question that's before the World Court right now. All nations give priority to the economic well-being of their citizens. Fossil fuels have been a great benefit to humanity, but fossil fuel emissions are also the main cause of climate change. We need to work together, all people, nations, and industries, on a realistic path to a bright future. Development of cheap renewable energies is useful, but not a panacea. It will not cause fossil fuels to go away any more than fossil fuels caused wood burning to go away. We are still burning as much wood and biomass as at any time in history. At long last, in just the past couple of years, the United Nations said, oh, we need to have nuclear power. We should triple nuclear power. Well, alas, that is easier said than done. It takes time. Renewables had several decades of unlimited subsidy via renewable portfolio standards. Why did we not instead have clean energy portfolio standards? Here, I think we scientists should accept part of the blame. We were well aware that nuclear power has the smallest environmental footprint of the major energies. And even old technology, nuclear power, saved millions of lives. Nuclear power has the potential to be inexpensive. But we were too passive, perhaps because we knew that we'd be criticized because of unfounded fear and disinformation about nuclear power spread by gullible media. And that brings me to my final point. I think the most important point. We understand why things are going haywire, why climate is a threat, why we are not reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The science is clear, but the COP meetings don't even talk about it. Economists agree that CO2 emissions will not decline as long as the waste products of fossil fuels can be dumped in the air without charge. It is straightforward for any nation to collect a fee from its small number of fossil fuel sources, domestic mines and ports of entry. The funds should be distributed uniformly to the nation's citizens. This can be done readily via a monthly or quarterly additions to debit cards. Most citizens will come out ahead. Wealthy people with a large carbon footprint would lose some money, but that would help address the universal problem of wealth disparity. The carbon fee can be set to rise at a rate that allows the fossil fuel industry time to invest in clean energies, carbon capture, or other alternatives. In this basic carbon-free and dividend system, no funds enter or leave a nation. However, in addition, justice requires that payments be made to citizens of nations that suffer climate change, climate damage, that they did little or nothing to bring about. Human-made climate change is caused not by today's instantaneous emissions, but by cumulative historical emissions, as shown in this figure and the next figure, which gives country by country emissions per capita emissions. So now I will turn it over to Elko, I believe.
Thank you. Need this one.
By the way, is the sound fine? Okay,
Good.
very good.
Thank you, Jim, for that slightly depressing message, which we all see coming, of course, all too clearly. Well, let me just stop here first. I'm a professor of ocean and climate change at Utrecht and secondary affiliated with University of Southampton in the UK. I've spent an 11-year spell at the Australian National University in Canberra as well. My concerns built up through that time, they're absolutely complementary to those concerns that Jim has been voicing, and I strongly agree. And I strongly agree also with the message that Jim was pushing forward here, is that things look worse than we thought. What we see in this chart is a reconstruction of deepwater, ocean deepwater temperature. In black is the traditional, largely model-based reconstruction based on deep sea oxygen isotopes. And then in the dark blue dots with the uncertainties around them, we see what is called clumped isotope temperatures, but there are also other methods now for direct temperature measurement in the deep sea in the past. Now, this is a record that goes from right 66 million years ago to the present at 0. And what we can see that in the past, global temperatures have always been more or less higher than they are now until we ended up in the ice ages, which is completely at the left. But there is a bigger message here, is that this recent work is indicating that one of the main methods, that the black record that we see there, is used to systematically underestimate the changes that did take place in deep sea temperature. And it's only of the last 5 years or so that we are seeing the systematic nature of this underestimate, and that we are getting to a more comprehensive understanding why this method used to give these too cold estimates. So we're facing a new reality now, the reality which is that deep sea temperatures have changed about twice as much as that we thought before. And the problem now is that deep sea temperature is a critical measure of global temperature. And as a result, we're beginning to realize that climate sensitivity, which is the amount of temperature change for a doubling of CO2 concentrations, may have been up to twice as much as we thought until now. And this is the longer term climate sensitivity. Now, on the next slide, we have yeah, here we go. What we see here is an example of a reconstruction of climate sensitivity as a probability density function. And essentially, the height of the curves indicates how likely a certain value is, where the value for climate sensitivity is given on the lower axis, on the x-axis. So what we can see, there's a clear peak sitting there about between 3 and 4 degrees Celsius from these from this conventional view, But we also see these big tails to the uncertainties to the lower estimates toward the left, and especially towards the higher estimates on the right. And those tails are very important because that's where we really don't know where it ends, what we think is possible. And there's been some development. You can see at the bottom some estimates from 2012 and from 2020 where the size of that uncertainty envelope was adjusted, was reduced, but we still had those big tails. Now, if we have a think about what these new data now begin to suggest then, is that now for the same CO2 changes, because the CO2 reconstructions haven't really changed that much, we're seeing up to about twice as much temperature change than we thought. And what this means is there are still uncertainties there, so I wouldn't want to go and put a precise number on it on this basis, but it is definitely illustrating that there's a very little chance that the climate sensitivity will fall toward the lower end of those uncertainty limits. And there is every opportunity, every chance that the actual climate sensitivity number is greater and sits towards that high end of the uncertainties, which is more or less what Jim is saying as well. We have been underestimating how much temperature we might get for a given CO2 value. So overall, we may end up with having to expect almost twice the long-term temperature change that we thought until recently. And there are critical implications for things such as sea level, and I will conclude with that quickly. Sea level change is very closely related to deep sea temperature, to ocean temperature. In the short term, because the ocean temperature determines the thermal expansion of seawater, so more space is needed for the same amount of water in the ocean basin, and that means that sea level comes up. And in the long term, the heat stored in the ocean is critical to driving melt of the great ice sheets. And then we're talking mainly about Antarctica and Greenland. So I'm not talking about glaciers here, that's a short-term effect. The big ice sheets, that's a longer-term effect, a multi-century effect. So ocean temperature is very important in those two of those of the three key measures for influencing climate for sea level that we see in this diagram. So again, we may expect sea level rise to be much more towards the high end of what we consider to be the uncertainties, and much more likely towards the high end than towards the low end of that uncertainty envelope, because there's more higher temperatures in the ocean. So both of these findings are devastating for the future outlook of small, low-lying island states. And therefore, I fully underwrite Professor Hansen's strong call to consider the need for greater caution about the consequences of climate change than what is called for by the existing understanding. And this is because there's a drastic shift happening in our existing understanding based on this new understanding of deep temperature changes in the ocean. So I will conclude there and pass on to Appie.
All right. Thank you very much also for the invitation of contributing here. My name is Appie Sluis. I'm a professor of Earth Sciences at Utrecht University, and I'm an expert on rapid climate change events in the geological past, and that's also what I'll talk about. Particularly, I'll talk about extreme weather, and it's also in Jim's declaration to the court. He's touched upon that, and particularly the impacts. What I'll show first is just a couple pictures of the big disaster that we've just seen in Valencia in Spain, where rivers flowed, big rivers flowed where they shouldn't, and all kinds of erosion took place in the country. All kinds of things were transported by that river, including very large particles, including cars. And so these are things that normally didn't happen in this region, and it's something that's very uncommon to us in our normal view of the world. Now, if you look at the satellite picture, you see that not only cars are transported. But what you see here is a satellite picture with Valencia in the north part of the figure. It's a satellite picture by NASA, and you also see the river just south of Valencia, and this massive transport of clays coming through the river into the ocean, essentially. And so typically these massive rainfall events, they are associated with erosion, transport of big particles, and the deposition of clay in the ocean real. Now what I'm going to do now is take you back about 56 million years ago to Spain again. And what you see here on the left is an illustration depicting all kinds of sediments that were deposited on top of each other through time. So the older layers are on the bottom and the younger layers are at the top. And what you see on the left here is on the left bottom is essentially there are illustrations of fossil soils, or soils of essentially a forested area where happy trees were growing and the soil was developing. And those soil developments are typically taking place on the timescale of several thousands of years. So that's the lower part, but at a certain point you hit sort of the middle part of this illustration, which are these funny layers with and what you see there is these thick funny layers were deposited during an episode of rapid climate warming, global warming, about 56 million years ago. And if you look at those rocks, you see essentially something very similar to what you saw in Valencia, some very big particles that were being transported. And so essentially all the different colors you see are different particles, or essentially clasts, boulders, that were being transported during an extreme mass wasting event, extreme weather event 56 million years ago in Spain as well, but then during a past episode of climate change. Now, if you go, so this is in central Spain. If you go towards the coast, you can actually see also the marine end member of this event, where instead of these big boulders, you set in the middle here where it says K and IETM, you get this deposition of clays in the ocean. And so you see again something very similar to Valencia, where you get big boulder transports on land and ultimately the mass wasting of clay into the marine realm. Now the important message here is that this is just not one event, but weather extremes like this occurred for tens of thousands of years during this past analog of climate warming. And so this is something that apparently occurred regularly, not just in Spain, but we see these type of sediments and the expression of extreme weather events in many regions of the world during this climate warming event, and then on the long term. So just to conclude, so if we're talking about global warming and extreme weather, extreme and disrupting weather events are inherent to rapid global warming phases. We see that not only in the modern, but we see it throughout geological history. And when this occurs, it occurs throughout the episode of when warming took place. So, and in the geological records, and also for the future, you have to think about thousands to tens of thousands of years that this weather will occur. In a sense, it will be a normal feature of future climates. The only way this can be limited is with a significant lowering of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, and you've just heard Jim talking about how that could or could not be achieved. Thank you.
Thank you. Ingrid.
Thanks. I'm not a scientist. I'm a professor of ethics of institutions at Utrecht University, and I also have a background in economics. So what I will do here is to add a few insights from climate ethics, which is the subfield in the field of ethics or moral philosophy that is concerned with asking what the ethical questions are related to climate change and also to climate action. And I thought from that rapidly growing and in the meantime vast literature that I would highlight 3 points that are relevant to the discussion today. The first is that philosophers tend to be a tribe that disagrees about almost everything, a large number of things. For some of these questions, there's also little hope that they will ever come to an agreement. And that may be because it concerns things that we cannot know for sure given the scientific method. And I'll leave it to your imagination what kind of questions that may be. It can also be because there's a clash of values or moral principles, and hence we cannot come to a normative conclusion. But in the case of climate change, there is no such disagreement. There is what is called in the literature convergence or even overdetermination of the moral conclusions. Independent of the ethical perspective that one starts from, independent of the moral principles that one thinks are weighty, academic scholarship in climate change is in large agreement that when it comes to the question of who is morally responsible for climate action, the answer is that these are the actors that have been emitting most of the greenhouse gases per person, that is rich nations, and also the corporations that are part of the fossil economy. And now, as I said, the precise reasons we have for those conclusions may differ depending on the kind of ethical framework you start from, but there's unanimity about conclusions. And that means that when Professor Hansen started by opening his contribution by talking about intergenerational justice and international justice, that this is fully supported by the academic literature in moral philosophy. And there's actually additional layers of injustice, including distributive justice, because we know that it is the 1% globally that is emitting more than, I mean, we know the numbers, but more than, say, they emit, for example, according to a paper in Nature, on average 101 tons CO2 equivalent emissions per year. And then you saw the figures in Africa, it's on average less than 1 ton. And then if we go to look at billionaires, we go into the realm of thousands of tons, only looking at their consumption, not even looking at their investment. So there are huge questions of distributive justice and injustices here. The second point I want to lift from this literature is that climate action is a case of what scholars in the social sciences and humanities call a prisoner's dilemma. And that means the prisoner's dilemma goes like as follows. It's a case where we are all better off if adequate action is taken, but given that the action is costly for us individually in the short term, we have an incentive to free ride on the efforts of others and hence to shirk our responsibilities. In other words, we prefer that climate action is taken. We prefer that other actors address climate actions so that we can enjoy the benefits, but we do not want to carry any of the burdens. Economists would say that this is rational for human beings. Well, rational in a certain understanding of rationality, of course. We know from scholarship, and now comes the important part, that the most effective way to address such prisoners' dilemmas is to enforce on all the relevant actors that they must abide by certain rules. Within a state, the government plays that role. For example, the government forces us to pay taxes, which they need to build infrastructure. Infrastructure is a clear case. We all benefit that there is infrastructure, but we prefer somebody else to pay for the infrastructure rather than ourselves having to pay taxes. So that's why we have a government and they force us to pay taxes. However, since we do not have a world government that can adequately enforce climate action on all national governments and multinational corporations, the climate case that is currently being considered by the International Court of Justice is extremely significant. So that they may, even though they do not have the power of a government, they may play some of that role of basically trying to tell everybody what needs to be done and by whom and who has a responsibility. It may unlock the solution, or at least get us onto the path of the solution of getting us out of this prisoner's dilemma in which the current levels and speed of climate action are inadequate, as we have also already heard before. My final comment is to clarify the distinction between law and morality. In an ideally just world, the law embodies morality. In reality, however, law and legal rulings are a product of human actions because it's human beings that make the laws, and they are not always without flaws. We do not know what the International Court will rule, but from a moral point of view, there is no doubt that a just law should rule that those who are responsible for climate change are also responsible to take adequate action in terms of climate mitigation, adaptation, and compensation, in order to keep the planet a place where humans and other species can live safely and flourishing life. And that is really the main message from moral philosophy, that this is what the literature converges of in terms of conclusions.
Thank you very much. And we're going to take questions and review comments that have come in by chat after my presentation here. It falls to me, I guess, to say something about these actual proceedings. before the International Court of Justice, also known as the World Court. And today is the sixth day of those proceedings. There are 4 more to come, the balance of this week. I've been following most of the oral presentations this week, and there is some commonality. All the nations, for instance, indicate that the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and its 2015 Paris Agreement present for the court some binding of applicable law to which it should take heed. But a difference arises as to whether those instruments should demark the beginning or the end of relevant state climate obligations. The majority of nations presenting here in The Hague emphasize that the corpus of relevant international law does not end with the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. Instead, they argue that these instruments supplement but do not in any way supplant the duties of nations under relevant principles of international common law. Those relevant principles undergird, for instance, the duty of prevention, including the duty to ensure that pollution stemming from one's own national borders or otherwise stemming from activities that nations allow or subsidize do not unduly harm their neighbors or do not unduly harm specific natural resources such as the ocean or the planet's common atmosphere and the climate system on which all nations and future generations must depend. But a minority of nations, on the other hand, stress that the sole set of relevant international obligations should be the UNFCCC and its Paris Agreement, and that's it. And they further argue to the court that those covenants provide only for duties of participation, transparency, timely submissions of emissions calculations, or the undertaking of purely voluntary commitments and so on. That is procedural performance only. And in that way, they urge the court to find or attach no obligation on any nation or upon the international community or even any grouping of, say, major emitting nations to achieve any specific outcome. Like, for instance, to hold the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So under this constricted view of relevant international laws to climate change, then, no one, that is no nation and no group of nations, not even, as I said before, for heaven's sake, the major historic emitters, none of these can be held responsible for our present dire circumstance, not to mention the horrendous additional impacts that are in the pipeline, as Dr. Hansen and his colleagues repeatedly warn about, unless it is we fundamentally change our path from business as usual. Now, some of these international law deniers, as I'll call them, such as shamefully my own country, the United States, now are even going further and take these very proceedings before the World Court as an opportunity to cast doubt on the continuing legal importance of certain principles that, in fact, were laid down in the Paris Agreement itself, in particular, as to the view that national duties with respect to addressing climate are to be evaluated with respect to, quote, the principle of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Now, how should the court go about adjudicating these differences? This will not be easy, in my view, but I will suggest here tonight one specific recommendation to the court. Get your fundamental facts right. In particular, are the nations in fact meeting their obligations in both deed and intent under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement? I think the court's answer to that must be a resounding no. For instance, on Wednesday of last week, the representative from the United States testified in part as follows to the court, and I quote, The United States has been doing its part, both at home and abroad, and is on track to cut national greenhouse gas emissions in half by the end of 2030, on the way to achieving its goal of net zero emissions no later than 2050. End quote. Well, the truth of the matter is that every clause of that statement is patently false. But how can the court know them to be false? The reason is pretty simple, at least with respect to a country such as the United States, because there, readily available authoritative national sources, including the United States Energy Information Administration, document in detail that, with respect again to the US, production of oil is now the highest of any nation and at its all-time peak in 2023. And further, that United States production of natural gas is also at an all-time high, and that we have also become the major natural gas exporting nation. Even so, our admissions claims, our submissions with respect to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, indicate that we're doing well because our domestic emissions are declining. The problem is that these emissions reporting that are do not include all of the emissions that are embedded in fossil fuel production and thus exports. And this is an obvious, important flaw in the UNFCCC system that I can only hope that the IPCC scientists will have explained when they met privately with the court last month. At minimum, what is required to save the planet, in my view, is not merely demand reduction, but supply reduction as well. The UNFCCC system, including the mechanisms erected under the Paris Agreement, these are important, but they remain grossly insufficient under the standard principles of international law. Accordingly, in my view, what the court needs to do after the close of these proceedings is to lay out the basic facts, lay down the law, determine culpability, direct a remedy, and in these ways raise hope for our beleaguered planet. Okay, so with that, I think that we could take questions, including from the chat, and I can scarcely read that. Okay, I'll proceed to read a question from the chat before taking any live. Hi, I'm from Mobilized News in the United States. Will this information be readily available for media outlets, and if so, how soon? I agree with the charade of the COP events. Yes. Actually, I should have gone to the final chart in our handout. Can we go again to that final chart?
The presentation.
To the presentation, the PowerPoint. It will be available here at cprclimate.org. How fast? I think we will be able to get it up by Thursday afternoon. So cprclimate.org is where you can, for those who missed it or those who wish to review it again. Okay, there's thank you for holding the panel. Let's see, there was a question above.
There's not a question.
Oh, thank you, James, for inviting me. Okay, no, that was not a question. Okay, Jeff asks, can the facts be known? We have to reflect. Can the facts? Well, I think that what was made clear here by our three scientists is that a lot of facts are known with great certainty about what is actually happening to our planet. And I'm wondering if, Jim, you'd like to speak to that a little bit. What is what is the source of our knowledge about all of these basic facts?
Yeah, well, that's a good point. In my paper, our paper that came out in Oxford Open Climate Change and the one that will come out in Environment, we criticize the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for what we think is excessive reliance on climate models. We need to pay attention to the history of the Earth, which Elko summarized much of the most relevant information, because that's our ground truth. The planet has been changing, and it is sensitive to changes in the composition of the atmosphere. That's shown by the history of the Earth. But also we need to look at the processes that are occurring now, because they tell us a lot. I mean, we look at the ocean is warming, and that's the mechanism by which the ice shelves, the tongues of ice that come out from the ice sheet into the ocean, are beginning to melt, and the grounding line is moving toward the ice sheet. It's telling us that we're getting very close to rapid sea level rise. And we know that in the past it's happened. The last time that it was warmer than the current interglacial period, the Eemian, 120,000 years ago, it was only 1 degree warmer than pre-industrial. So we've already reached that level. But during that period, sea level suddenly went up by at least a few meters, implying the most logical interpretation is that the West Antarctic ice sheet, which is sitting on bedrock well below sea level, and therefore it's the most vulnerable ice on the planet, that it disintegrated rapidly. In less than 100 years, sea level went up several meters. So so we have different sources of information. Models are useful if used in conjunction with the history of the Earth and with the observations of exactly what's going on the planet now.
Right, but I mean, again, how do we know what occurred 125,000 years ago?
Well, it's in the geologic record. There are a number of ways you can see on the shorelines the evidence of where the sea level was as a function of time. Mm-hmm. It's actually remarkable how the scientists who do this work can extract information out of the ice cores and ocean cores, and one of the most interesting recent things is we did not know how cold the last ice age was. Just as Elko was talking about on the 60 million year ocean temperature, there are uncertainties about that. Well, I can't think of his name at the moment. You might be able to remind me, but it was able to sample groundwater that was deposited during the last ice age. And from the abundances of the different noble gases, he could measure the temperature that existed during the last ice age, and found that it was colder than we thought. It was, and that was another reason why we know the climate sensitivity is higher than what the models were assuming.
Right. And Appy, you noted that there were these major changes reflected in the sedimentary record in Spain, where there were significant movement of boulders and during extreme weather events, and I think some of the movements of those boulders were also, you discussed them in your paper, ice melt, sea level rise, and superstorms, Jim, that I think Ilko, you were a co-author of as well. So Appy, is one of the ways that scientists come to their conclusions about these things, seeing similar records in different parts of the planet?
Yeah, essentially that's what we do, right? So it's so we try to get, so every time you're looking at a drill core at one particular location at climate change or climate variability, you only have one location, and that's why we tend to generate that type of data not only in one place but globally, and to see how one location compares to another, and to see whether a change you see at one particular location is actually a global change. And so there's big, also particularly in the pub or wherever you have discussions about climate change, there's always a discussion about, perhaps there was wine being grown in Greenland during the Middle Ages, so it was warm before. But the very important difference between what we see in the Middle Ages and what we see now is that what we're experiencing now is global warming, and in the Middle Ages it wasn't. And so it was warm in Northwestern Europe, but it was cold in Asia. And so this is a really important point. So to generate those reconstructions on a global scale, to have a picture of global average temperature, is a really important component of doing these reconstructions properly, and to get an image of what's happening on the global scale versus the regional scale. Yeah.
Yes.
On the topic of the climate sensitivity, obviously, if what you're saying, Dr. Hansen, is correct about, and you as well, about climate sensitivity being so much higher, I mean, that could be pretty disastrous for everyone. Also, I mean, you talked about small island developing states. I mean, for them, it might mean that even if we very, very rapidly stop emitting CO2, they would still be doomed. So I was just wondering if you could reflect on if that is. Do you hope you're wrong? And if it is right, what next?
Well, of course, it would be nicer if climate sensitivity were lower. But you know, what makes climate sensitivity high is feedbacks, amplifying feedbacks. And those feedbacks have to, of course, come into play in response to forcings and in response to the planet's energy balance or imbalance. So regardless of the sensitivity, if we reduce the gases such that the planet is in balance or slightly negative balance, then the planet would stop warming and even cool off a bit. So it's not, so, and that's true independent of high sensitivity or low sensitivity. So it's not an unsolvable problem. It's just that we're not addressing it. We're, well, basically continuing business as usual. And for a good reason. As I said, fossil fuels are remarkable. You know, one gallon, which is 3.7 liters, 3.8 liters, contains of gasoline or petrol, contains the work equivalent of 400 hours of a healthy adult. That's why it's raised the living standards around the planet. So we need to find substitutes, or we need to capture the CO2. But those things are doable. But as long as you don't have to do it, as long as you can dump the stuff in the air without any cost, that's the global commons problem, where we're just taking advantage of the fact that you can do that, and we need to discuss that. And the IPCC the COP meetings, United Nations meetings, really don't spend time addressing this fundamental requirement.
Yeah, yes, please.
I've been watching the hearings closely as well, and from listening to the oral statements and from reading the written submissions, I was struck by the fact that the more vulnerable countries seem to rely more heavily on science in their submissions to the report, and quite a lot. And I wondered if you could discuss sort of or hazard a kind of a thought about what this means about the strength of their arguments before the report.
Well, you're going to say something?
Yeah, I will. You go first.
Well, Yeah, we've thought for some time, why can't we get some of these small island nations, for example, to really start to make a stink and file lawsuits and things? It turns out that it's analogous to what's happening at the COP meetings, where a little bit of money is dangled out like a carrot. And these countries are, for good reason, they for the sake of their citizens, they're willing to take support from whether it's from Australia or the United States or whoever, and therefore they're not standing up and saying we've got to solve the problem, or they were not willing to file a lawsuit. I better let Dan finish that.
Let me, um, well, let me just say some of them are standing up. Like, for example, the reason why we have this proceeding here is because Vanuatu stood up. Didn't stand up alone. Well, initially it did stand up alone. It organized the rest of the Pacific Island communities, and then they brought it to the United Nations General Assembly, which has the authority to refer questions to the International Court of Justice. So it was not out of the goodness of the heart of the major emitters that the court is now uh, uh, dealing with this question. But Dr. Hansen is right. More could be done, and I think more will be done by some of these nations that are desperate. But it's not only that there's the prospect at the COPs to provide a little funding through loss and damage, but most of these nations are entirely largely dependent on shipments, including of diesel, from the major oil-producing nations. And they're also highly dependent on some of the major emitting nations, and not merely the United States and Australia, but also China, to help with a lot of infrastructure development, including some development that is necessary to try to keep the oceans at bay. But I think your point is correct. Many of these nations that are taking leadership and banging the gavel, so to speak, before the International Court of Justice are relying on the science, including science from the IPCC, which, while their reports, I would say, do not reflect the most recent cutting-edge science, have been increasingly dire in their assessments about the situation. And the most recent, which is the 6th assessment report, says unequivocally that that all of global warming is caused by human activities, and so there's been very little equivocation on some of the basics. Although I would say certainly Dr. Hansen and others believe that they are still underreporting the what is likely to befall us in the future, because they have been very conservative in adopting their fundamental understanding of climate sensitivity and other things like that. So yeah, I think that they are trying to the extent that they can to call attention to the relevant climate science and asking this court to attend to the actual facts of the situation. Yes, sir.
Maybe for Professor Banks, a lot of talk about institutions obviously maybe not being up to the task. I just came from back for this from the COP, and it's obvious that obviously when you put 200 countries in a room, it's going to be pretty hard to agree on anything. But maybe I was wondering if you have any ideas on when you say philosophers and ethicists are much united around it. Do you have any sort of ideas for how that that could translate to a more effective institutional approach, or to
Yeah, I had just basically following up on some of the discussion here. I do think that there's science in the sense of the facts of the earth and the biosphere and so on. And then there is basically the social sciences, how people interact. And there really you cannot make a proper analysis without a good understanding of political economy, how the economy works, but the interaction with politics. So basically the systems of human cooperation that we have, and that is inevitably normative. So that means that I think that we might actually need more attention in the whole project of basically, I mean, what the IPCC wants to do is, of course, making the basic facts, or giving the scientific facts, but you also, if you want to really come up with recommendations that may actually save the planet for next generations, I do think you have to go radically interdisciplinary, and that means including social scientists broadly who know about politics, about the economy, the things you were just mentioning as examples, how you are dependent, and hence you don't make a legitimate claim because you are dependent on a nation, and also the normative dimensions. So I do think it's important to involve all these disciplines in these workings, because I think, I mean, it is the task of, say, philosophers, but also political scientists, to call bullshit when they see bullshit. So if they are at such a meeting and they basically see that there are power games being played, it's their task to point that out. Just like I think it's a task of the scientist when the US makes a statement that is factually wrong, to also point out, and that is, I think, the role we have to play. But yes, whether that will help enough, that is an open question.
Okay, a writer says, just an observation being the state of ecologic degradation, the market metrics at COPs is an insult to human ethics and science. So since my point of view, or from my point of view, the first thing to do is to change metrics of the discussion to international system of units. That means to balance Earth's energy, or to eliminate Earth's energy imbalance. And of course, Dr. Hansen, you have, and also Ilko, I know, you have written about Earth's energy imbalance. Maybe you'd like to say something about that as a fundamental metric for consideration.
Well, I think Jim just said it already. That's really how you measure what's going to happen, and everything else is basically a derived summary parameter. But the Earth's energy imbalance is really what's going to tell you what's, are we going to get warmer, or are we going to get colder, or are we going to stay level? It's really the same as the net balance of the tap and the outlet on a bathtub. If you have more outgoing than ingoing, then the bath is going to empty out. If it's the other way around, the bath is going to fill up, and that's more or less the same with the energy imbalance. It's pretty straightforward metric. And so I would agree with what is said there, and with what Jim just said, is that's definitely where we need to aim the discussion, and that's where we need to take action.
Yeah. Well, this brings up a very difficult aspect of the problem, a very controversial aspect, and that is, if you look at this imbalance, for a decade or two, it was around half a watt, but it has actually increased over the last decade or so, and it's partly because the aerosol had been reducing by reflecting sunlight. We're minimizing that imbalance. And so as they've stopped helping out, we see just how big the imbalance is. And we see how difficult it is going to be to restore a balance. And it's very likely that over the next decade or so, we're going to realize that we're going to lose both the Arctic sea ice and the Antarctic ice sheet is going to start shedding ice faster and faster. And then we're going to say, holy shit, we're in real trouble. And then the issue arises, well, how can we restore the balance? Because you can't do it just by reducing your greenhouse gases. You can't do it fast enough. So it's going to raise the question, oh, we better reflect some sunlight. And that's going to become an even bigger issue. I can predict that because we can see where things are headed. And we better, you know, we have to push as hard as we can to get emissions to go down over the next years. But at the same time, we had better understand the system well enough that we know when it becomes an emergency. Are we going to break the glass and say we got to do something? That's we shouldn't rule out research on that because we got to understand. And in no way does that just I think actually when you start talking about that, it probably causes people to get more serious about the emissions and say, oh, we better reduce the emissions.
Yeah. Yes.
Just to follow up on that, on the sort of geoengineering side of things, obviously there's a lot of concern also that even just positing that can, you know, generate ideas of, you know, people using that as an offset for their emissions or having all these consequences where that even with when it's done with the best of intentions, perhaps to fix the problem, it might not actually make things better. So just wondering how you look at that, and when you say, you know, we have to find a time to know when to break the glass in case of emergency, how do you do that? How do you decide when the time comes?
That's the big issue. But you have to recognize we are geoengineering the planet right now enormously at a rate 10 times faster than any natural example that we know about. So in a way, it's analogous. You know, we have co-authors on our paper who are young people, you know, in their 20s, who are saying you should not rule out studying that off-ramp because unless you're taking the actions to get the emissions down fast enough to restore the planet's energy balance, you'd better think about possible alternatives. But clearly, the world isn't ready for that. So what we have to do is push as hard as we can to get the emissions to go down, but also understand the system well enough that we can offer the best knowledge that we have to deal with the situation, which is only going to become clearer and more critical as time goes on.
Yes.
And bringing it back to before, do you think there's a need for judges to be better educated on science?
I didn't.
Is there a need for judges our colleague from The Guardian is talking about the World Court judges, but probably it's also relevant to any judge. Is there a need for judges to be more educated about the science?
Is there anyone in specific that you're asking?
I think I would say there's a clear need for people in general, including the judges, to be more aware of what's happening, and not to blow our own trumpets, but we study this system, we work on it every day, we go home thinking, where are we going? Why is this happening still? And people like Jim have been flagging this issue since the 80s, and we're only going up and up and up in the emissions. There's a clear issue there of education not coming through, and on experts not being heard or pushed into a corner where they have to be as careful as possible with what they say. Otherwise, they can't be part of the exercise or whatever. And we need to make sure that this is actually recognized as a real emergency that's coming. And that's not coming in 2030 or 2050. It's probably coming next year or something like that, or it's here already. From a geological perspective, we're looking at this, and we also hear this discussion, are we coming towards a sixth mass extinction? We're in it. We're not coming, we're in it. It's just not a process, it's not a Hollywood movie that happens from one day to the next. It happens over decades. And I think that realization is just not sinking in, and there's a need for that scientific message to come through better in the general public, including the judges, yes.
Actually, I'd like to elaborate a little bit on this, because the question as it was presented, understandably, to the World Court focused especially on potential impacts to highly vulnerable nations, particularly small island developing states. But Dr. Hansen and I walked here tonight, the 1.2 kilometer walk, and we were relatively comfortable in the 43-degree Fahrenheit weather and walking here. But it's my understanding that the warmth that we're experiencing here in Europe is in part a function of heat transfer through ocean currents that themselves are in jeopardy. And what I'm wondering, and this is following up on a point that you made, Ingrid, is has the message sufficiently gotten out, not merely to the highly vulnerable nations, but to the major emitting nations in the European Union and the United States as well, that this is not a long-term threat, that there is actual major dislocations that could occur from business as usual to the richer nations. And I was wondering if anyone would like to talk to that.
Well, I was going to make one more comment too.
Sure.
If that's okay. So I think more and more people realize, and I think all of us realize, that climate change is an inherent part of our daily lives right now. So it doesn't only affect the job of judges, it affects most jobs actually. Even if it's just becoming wetter, if you're going through a shower, in this country biking towards your work than you used to 50 years ago. And so I think from that perspective, I think it makes complete sense that people know why this is happening, and so education is a really important point. I'm not a legal expert, but I can imagine that that education should be sufficient for everybody to properly do their jobs. And if that means for a legal scholar that any implications of climate change is affecting their work, then they should. Yes. I'm sorry. That's that was
Yeah.
off topic.
Yeah. So considerations of self-interest among the wealthier nations, should that also be a priority?
It's one for Ingrid or not.
In order to make it clear that yeah.
Right. I mean, you were talking about the need to consider political realities previously, and the reality is that I think concern about distant, far-off nations, island nations, drowning has not sufficed.
Yeah.
But what about climate change and the wealthier nations?
But I mean, there's now Valencia, but we had a couple of years ago, we had at the cross point of Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany, there was also what is seen as the first climate disaster in this part of Europe. I can't remember how many people died, but many people died. Villages were swept away. And it's remarkable how I mean, there are some brave and generally young people who kept pursuing this, who make monuments, who have tried to go to court in Belgium, and because also they lost people of their generation. People in their 20s just died because they were swept by the water. And still, and now you have Valencia, and we've had a few others, and still, it's remarkable how we are just going on with our lives. And I really think we have to bring together. I mean, there's also a question in the chat about whether our political systems are capable, but I think it's really about we have human society of human beings, and that's the only kind of entity that can solve this. I mean, ideally on a global level. So that means we have to but we have, because of also, in my analysis, changes to the economic system, we've become much more fragmented and drawn into a particular way of living. So I think I mean, this is not the topic of this press conference, so I don't want to go there too far, but I think there's something deeper, really. If you think about solutions, we really have to talk political economy. We have to talk about what are the implicit normative assumptions and the ideas of human nature and the ideas of society, social contract, and so forth in the way we set up, the way we live together. That's our economy, our societies. And then ask, is that compatible with the way out to a habitable planet? And I think the answer is right now no. But that is why I think this question, why it's so difficult, because you have all the evidence that comes from the sciences, but on top of that, you have a whole layer about analysis of the society. And then there's a question, how do you can get people to really bring this all together, which means you have to, I mean, Appy calls it educate people, but I also just think have much more conversations in society. So that's why things like a citizens' assembly where people discuss this is very important, even if they don't have actual power to force their governments to do things. It is a group of people that come together, listen to the scientists, listen to the other experts, and then start to raise awareness and then spread it in society. But the problem is, of course, it's not much. I mean, we really have to move fast. So some of these things are just, yeah, it's not as if we have a lot of time to make that emergency also be felt and have it realized.
Great. Question for Jim. Thanks for excellent and clear presentation.
Oops.
Aerosol reduction from shipping has been occurring over a number of years, which contributes to a gradual warming trend. It seems that something else must be driving the huge temperature jump in the past 2 years. El Nino is part of that, but certainly not all. Intense and expansive marine heat waves have emerged in recent years and seem a likely contributor. Shipping aerosols contribute to these heat waves along major shipping routes. What explains heat waves in southern oceans? where there are few ships.
Yeah, actually, the as I showed, and to a limited degree in my few charts, and it's will be shown in more detail in the paper that's coming out in January. There's actually good consistency between the location of the forcings and the observed temperature change. The region where the sulfate aerosols from shipping are largest and have a large fraction of the total of the natural plus human-made aerosols is the North Pacific and North Atlantic, and that's where we're getting the response, and that's where we're seeing the change in the Earth's energy balance. It's quite large, you know, over those huge areas. There's like 5 watts, and average over the planet half a watt. So it's actually it actually works out. I'm not quite sure whether that answers that question, but I think that there is a clear cause and effect in the case of the observed temperature change of the past couple of years. It is about half of it is from the El Nino, and most of the other half is from the ship aerosol changes.
Can we let this person speak through the internet if she wants to follow up? If she's still with us?
Hi there. Yes, this is
I
Jennifer
kind of think
Francis.
this,
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, great. Yeah, so thank you, Jim, again. And thank you all for a truly interesting and disturbing panel. It's been great to be part of this. And but I still wonder about the ocean heat waves that clearly have been a huge factor in the last, especially 5-ish years. And those emerging in the Southern Ocean seem to be not related to a change in aerosols. Certainly in the Northern Hemisphere, especially the North Pacific, North Atlantic, where we see a lot of the ship tracks, it makes sense that there's a bigger impact there. But you know, this year, 2024, is breaking a new global temperature record, and yet we shifted to neutral and weak La Nina conditions. So it just seems to me that these marine heat waves are playing just a huge role in these last couple of years, and it's not really clear to me why they have emerged so strongly just in the last, say, 4 or 5 years. Because the aerosol decline has been quite gradual, and I don't know when the law went into effect to require the shipping to use different fuels, but it's, you know, that should be more of a gradual change.
no, the ship aerosol regulation went into effect January of 2020, and it seemed to have been obeyed to like 80% at least. So it's a very sudden change. That's what's nice about this experiment. It is a clean, a sharp change, and it works out. But and what you said about the Southern Hemisphere, that's also interesting. You know, around the Southern Ocean, the temperature has not gone up very much. In the you know, south of 60 degrees south. And if you look at the IPCC models, there's a discrepancy. The ocean temperature has not increased. And I think that has a simple explanation, and that is the effect of the increasing melt of the ice shelves around Antarctica, which is, you know, reducing the density of the surface water and has slowed down over the past several decades, the rate of deep water formation around Antarctica. Now, there was a burp in about 2016 where there was increased release of heat from the deep ocean, from the ocean close to Antarctica, but over the decades, it is changing in a way that overall makes sense. Now, the particular patterns where you see these heat hotspots, I don't know if that's I don't know if the whole ocean surface temperature is rising, and so I'm not surprised there are some spots where it's particularly hot, but I'm not sure. I don't have the understanding of the ocean dynamics to really comment on that.
Okay, let me read the bottom one and then the top one.
I think the top one can be just simply answered with yes.
Okay, what is your reaction to a recent paper in Science that attributes the sudden increase in temperature to a reduction in clouds? Is this in accordance or in contradiction with your theory? Obviously.
Yeah, obviously. Actually, one of my co-authors contacted the author of that paper a few months ago and said, by the way, we already mentioned this in our Oxford Open Climate Change. And he said, oh, he would refer to our paper. Oh. But he didn't.
He didn't, okay. Well, there you go.
I don't care, that's not important. We don't need more citations. What we need is action.
Exactly. Yeah, so I guess it's good. All right, kuleana is a Hawaiian word roughly translated as both responsibility and privilege. There is no burden, only the joy of that responsibility. My suggestion, use that term, kuleana, or create another term, and lead with it. Repetition resonates, leads to adoption, and is repeated in our snippet-only world. All right, thank you for that. You went too quickly there, but okay, we had already read a couple from Jeff. Let's see, Nelson. This is a question for Ingrid regarding the socio-political realities you mentioned. If we consider what adults have been doing on the issue of global heating now and in the past as effectively attempts to create top-down solutions, with the results being negligible at best, would you comment on the prospects of bottom-up solutions, such as the youth climate strike and even more radical actions for you, Ingrid?
Yeah, I think there is a clear way to reason about this, which is what is at stake if we continue business as usual. Actually, business is a nice word here because that's what's large part creating the problem. What is at stake and what is, with these alternative actions, what are we possibly sacrificing? So there is, for example, an ecological thinker from Sweden who argues that property rights can be damaged because if that were to lead to effective change in climate action, that's of course a guess whether that will happen. But his name is Andreas Malm. It's a very radical view, but I think if you reason about it lucidly as in terms of interests at stake, the interests at stakes right now are basic preconditions for life for an increasing number of people. So I think actually, despite that his analysis is very radical, I think it is sound according to my discipline. Namely, what you would sacrifice is property rights, but property rights defend property, not life. Only when property is something like water or things that meet basic needs. So I fear for those who want to do business as usual that actually an analysis that doesn't start from the world as it is and all the power balances there, but looks at this independently, would recommend or would, I shouldn't say recommend, but would justify actions, assuming, and if we know that, or if we can have reasonable expectations that are effective, that we would currently classify as very radical. And so that just also shows me that our thinking about what is at stake here hasn't really gotten to the place where, I mean, we haven't really realized what is at stake if we compare what the business as usual, what we go on. We are in a certain type of thinking about the social contract, about the importance of the economy, and especially the importance of material interests, of, I mean, if I may say so, profit, that just overrules these other concerns. So yeah, I think, I don't know. I mean, we are waiting really for a question or for something that will unlock the fact that nothing sufficiently happens. And I think it is the hope of Vanuatu and other countries that this, I think it's not a ruling in a legal sense. No, it's a recommendation legally. It's what the court will do.
Technically, this is an advisory opinion.
That was what word I was looking for. Right. So that the advisory opinion will be a game changer, for example, in the type of arguments that can be put forward at the COP or at other. And then if that doesn't work, then I don't know what in the area of kind of peaceful solutions is still available.
Well, you know, an advisory, this is not any court. So an advisory opinion from this court really represents the most authoritative statement as to the international obligations of nations with respect to this statement. So sure, it'll be useful rhetorically at the COPs, but it'll also be useful for people you know, who may be bringing cases in various national jurisdictions, to the extent that those courts are interested in international law. Like, for example, in the United States, treaties under Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution are the law of the land. And so systems set up pursuant to treaties like the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change or the Paris Agreement or international law more generally, I think should, by right, be considered by courts throughout the world. Yep. So, you know, it is, as Dr. Hansen said, it is possible that an authoritative statement from this court could be an important boost at this time. Okay, let's see. Maybe we'll just take two more. Were any more questions from persons here? Okay, so let's see. The United States operates under a system of minority rule, evident in institutions such as the Senate, the Electoral College, gerrymandering, the two-party system, and lifetime appointments to the Supreme Court. The structure prioritizes the power of the few over the will of the many. It's no exaggeration to say that minority rule has significantly contributed to the failure to address critical issues like climate change, despite the fact that a majority of Americans support taking action. Do members of the panel think stronger and more effective democratic governance would be helpful in addressing this? This is such an important question that perhaps we'll end on it and give people a chance to opine if they wish. Of course, the United States is not the only government that is at least nominally under a democratic form, so you don't need to be expert in the United States to opine on this. Ingrid, do you have something you want?
Yeah, I think it's very important, and it again shows that all these layers are important, including the political layer. I am increasingly interested in seeing what citizens' assemblies can do, despite that they have no formal power, but precisely because the epistemic factor, that people get the information. So citizens' assembly is not just citizens coming together, but they recommend also something to their government, but they are informed. It's not just a vote on a question, yes or no, but you are informed by experts, you deliberate, which is very important, and then you make a recommendation. And they are really increasingly being used to think about climate. So I'm hoping that because that's something we can set up relatively quickly. I mean, to change the American political system will probably require a bit more work and time.
Thank you. Let me go, Appy, Ilko, and let Jim have the last word on this question, if that's okay.
I really don't have an expert opinion on this issue. No.
Sure.
No, I'm more or less the same as what Appy is saying, is just saying that the system's not just failing people in the United States. It's absolutely everywhere, one can say. And so I'm with Ingrid on this one. It's time to get much more direct people involvement.
Yeah, this is the bottom line. The fundamental problem is, especially in the United States, the democracy is not working. And it took me years. I went to Congress and spoke with people. The senators and representatives are intelligent, articulate people and concerned, but they told me, well, but I can't get the votes for what you're suggesting with regard to a carbon fee, for example. And it became very clear that the role of special interests, special financial interests, makes the solution of this problem very difficult, if not impossible, if we don't fix that problem. And the truth is that majority of people in the U.S. are completely fed up with the fact that Washington is a swamp of special interests. And even the ordinary person understands that. And they want that to be fixed. But we're stuck with two political parties who both accept money from special interests. And once they get elected, they've joined an elite and they want to stay elected, and they take money from special interests. So I think we need in the United States need a third party that takes no money from special interests, and I think that there would be a stampede to support that party. But it's hard to do in the way the system is rigged now. The third parties have a very difficult situation, so we need to get ranked voting, which would avoid the problem of a third party being a spoiler. And there is an organization, Rank the Vote, which is now working in all 50 states to try to bring this about. But we have to fix the democracy if we're going to fix the climate problem, I think. And it's also discouraging that this goes all the way back to President Eisenhower when he gave his farewell address. He was going to warn the country about the role of military-industrial congressional complex. Just this, but in giving this speech, he eliminated the congressional thing. So and we just have not addressed the fact that there's this bribery going on. But I think that young people are beginning to understand that. And so I think there's prospects for addressing this. And I hope that it can be done fast enough to beat the calamity that's otherwise coming down the road.
Well, everyone, thank you very much for coming together in this panel for this excellent discussion. Thank you for everyone here and in the press and online. Again, we'll try to have the archive of this whole discussion up at cprclimate.org, I hope, by Thursday evening. Also at that website, I attempt to try to do analysis of major developments, and I certainly will undertake an analysis of these full proceedings there, and then again of the International Court of Justice's decision when it finally comes out, probably in a couple of months. Thank you very much.
Thank you.